All right, Rachel, let's see if you can keep on time.
Come on.
A little competition never hurt.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel Cohen with the Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative, a terrible mouthful. And I'm happy to share with you a bit about the DNDi model, which has a different history and experience than MMV, than the TB Alliance, and some of the other product development partnerships. DNDi really originated out of the frustration that MSF and other, MSF, for those that don't know, Doctors Without Borders, or Médecins Sans Frontières, that MSF clinicians experienced in the field in the mid-90s to late 90s when the tools that they needed to treat patients just simply didn't exist. They didn't exist because either they were there, but they were unaffordable and so out of reach. They didn't exist because they were perhaps toxic or people had developed resistance to those tools, or they didn't exist because they literally didn't exist and nobody was investing into research into a handful of diseases that really fell completely outside of the market logic. So here I'll give a very quick example because I think it's timely. Really at the heart of really why DNDi was developed is a disease you've probably not heard of called human African trypanosomiasis, or African sleeping sickness. Thank you, good. A disease that claimed hundreds of thousands of lives between the 1970s and 1990s and has claimed millions over the centuries, but which is now heavily concentrated in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's transmitted by the bite of a tsetse fly, and at the time that DNDi was created, we had one, essentially, tool available to treat that disease. It was a drug called melarsoprol, which is an arsenic derivative, so toxic that it kills 1 in 20 patients, and is called by patients and the community fire in the veins because it literally burns when you inject it. So this was the best that science had to offer patients with sleeping sickness. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. In the meantime, so that was really sort of the core type of experience that gave rise to DNDi. So DNDi, in fact, was a collaboration at the beginning between MSF, which joined forces with 5 public sector research partners. So the Kenya Medical Research Institute, the Osvaldo Cruz Foundation in Brazil, the Indian Council of Medical Research, the Malaysian Ministry of Health, the Institut Pasteur in France, and then WHO TDR. And those organizations remain the founding partners, of course, but also the heads of those institutions are sitting on the governing board of DNDi and continue to make all of the decisions about the direction of the organization. To date, DNDi has delivered 7 new treatments for 5 different diseases. I won't go into detail about these, but each one of them is easier to use than previously existing therapies. Each one is affordable, field adapted, and actually non-patented. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these, just to say at the clinical level, DNDi is highly, highly hands-on. We have teams in countries, and we work in very close partnership with ministries of health to define target product profiles, to conduct, obviously, clinical trials, and to accelerate the implementation of new treatments. However, at the sort of earlier end or the left side of the R&D pipeline, we're much more virtual. And of course, we rely on the private sector, where the capacity to discover and develop drugs has been concentrated historically. And we have partnerships at all stages of the R&D process. Sorry, that's one of those terrible slides that's impossible to read. Just gives you a sense right now that while we started, first of all, along the left-hand column, if you see we have expanded from focusing initially on 3 or 4 diseases to now 8, plus we have a new initiative that we've been incubating with the World Health Organization that I'll speak about briefly. On the right side, we have the 7 treatments that are in process. And just want to say a quick word because we are at kind of an important and very exciting moment. Because if all goes well, tomorrow, actually, the EMA, we hope to get a positive opinion for the approval of fexinidazole, which will be the first ever all-oral cure for sleeping sickness. The opinion has to be positive before we can go. So keep your ears open tomorrow. Those are our funding partners. I like Sir George's idea that we not refer to them as donors. And I think it's important here to mention that we have a sort of set of policies around who we accept financing from. First of all, we strive to maintain a balance between public and private resources. So about 50% of our funding comes from the public sector, 50% from the private sector. And we don't let any single donor give more than 25% of our overall funding, which is, of course, to guard against any undue influence. So I'm going to be running out of time shortly, but who in the room has heard of the concept of delinkage? Oh boy. Okay, so delinkage is an idea that originated actually with some folks here in Washington, D.C., that is about an alternative way of thinking about financing and incentivizing research and development that doesn't rely on high prices to recoup the R&D investments. It's kind of a radical idea, except not really, because we have a system today of incentives that works, we think, to deliver innovation and to deliver important health technologies for patients. It's called the intellectual property system. But it doesn't necessarily always work. It doesn't always incentivize the right kind of innovation, and as we all know, it can lead to high prices which create access barriers. So DNDi considers that at least aspects of our model could be considered a practical illustration of what happens when you delink the cost or the financing of research and development from both the price of the product or, in the case of antibiotics, for example, from volume-based sales. And one of the things that we're trying to do with WHO is to see whether this model could be applied to the area of antimicrobial resistance. So with WHO, we have created a new initiative called GARDP. We're terrible at acronyms, DNDi and GARDP. It's called the Global Antibiotic Research and Development Partnership. It's a joint initiative of WHO and DNDi. We will be focusing initially in GARDP on 4 important areas, which includes neonatal sepsis, STIs, in particular drug-resistant gonorrhea, a huge problem in this country and globally, not only in low and middle-income countries. More kind of upstream memory recovery, an exploratory initiative, and a platform for developing potentially pediatric antibiotics. So just to leave with a few thoughts and questions. Could the model of PDPs broadly or of DNDi and GARDP, should it be limited to areas where there's sort of really obvious market failure? Or are there lessons for other areas of public health importance potentially? What is the role of the PDP approach? We're often described by others as being sort of the ones that pick up something at the late stage or that do reformulations of existing drugs. But our argument, I think MMV would agree, is that we have been functioning actually more as a bench-to-bedside, end-to-end approach. What kind of incentives and financing policies need to be put in place? Are the current ones targeting the right players? Are they targeting the right stage of the R&D process? What kind of behaviors are being incentivized? And are they the right behaviors? Access, is this something kind of optional that we should think about once we have a product, or is this something mandatory that needs to be built actually into the R&D strategy? And finally, just a question for the room perhaps, who's setting the rules? Do we need to think about putting the public back in public-private partnerships and the lingo around multi-sectoral engagement? And do we demand actually a public return on public investment? Can we explore whether there's tension there, and can we resolve that tension in the interest of public health? Thank you.